Welcome to another episode of the brand called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I am your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior and respected professional from the world of academia, from Wiltshire, UK, Professor Dave Snowden. Dave, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
Professor Snowden is the director and founder of the Cynefin Center. So, Dave, for my viewers and listeners, and for me, can you briefly describe the Cynefin framework and its key domains, and particularly how it is applied to leadership?
Okay, let's start with the pronunciation because it's Welsh. So it's pronounced Cynefin.
Yeah? Oh, my apologies. Cynefin.
Welsh is phonetic, but we have a different alphabet.
Okay.
So Cynefin basically is derived from natural science. It identifies three basic states: ordered states, complex states, and chaotic states.
Right.
And if you want a really simple metaphor for that, it's solid, liquid, and gas. So if solid, it's highly constrained, it's predictable, we know what to do with it. If something is liquid, it's difficult to contain, it's much more fluid, patterns form. If something is gas, then it's almost impossible to contain and it's random. Yeah? And if you know anything about latent heat, you'll know there are phase shift transitions between those. Boil water to 100 degrees, it doesn't immediately become steam, it requires heat. So if you're in the business in a leadership position and you want to open up possibilities at low energy cost, you relax constraints, you move from order to complexity. If you want to exploit the results, you increase the constraints and see if they're sustainable. You move effectively from complex to order. And if you over-constrain a system which isn't naturally constrainable, then you'll bring about catastrophic failure, collapse into chaos. And the final point on this, and this is the simple version of Cynefin, there are three more layers to it. There's a thing in physics called the triple point, which is a balance between pressure and temperature, where it's equiprobable whether something will become solid, liquid, or gas. In Cynefin, that's the central domain, which far too many people leave out, which is called the aporetic domain. That's a Greek word. It means an unanswerable question, putting yourself in a position where you have to think differently, and that's really important to Cynefin.
Amazing. And how has the Cynefin framework evolved since you introduced it? And what are some of the improvements you've made over the last few years?
It goes way back. It goes back in early form about 25 years now. In its 5-domain form, 21 years. Next week, we're coming up to an anniversary. So it started off, I was working with Max Basso, whose books I strongly recommend to anybody, and I took his eye space and I started to riff on that. And that then created the basic version of Cynefin, which was then, I think, simple, complicated, complex, chaotic, and the middle space, which was called disordered. And yeah, that had issues or problems, but that took off. It became the basis of the Harvard Business Review cover article. And then gradually over time, various things happened to it. So simple became clear. We started to say, well, let's start by talking about order. You know, we can divide order into two, which is clear and complicated, but that's more of a judgment issue. It's not a physical issue in the way that order is. Then we added liminality, which was boundaries between domains. And then the final resolution was calling the central domain aporetic, as I described earlier. And that took about 18, 19 years. And I think this is the key to understand on sense-making frameworks. We didn't just do a quick study of 20 companies, derive a framework, publish it, and build a consultancy business. We took natural science, we said, what does this mean? And then we started to evolve theory and practice over a period of time, resolving tensions in the framework as we went. So that's been the rough pathway.
Amazing. So I'll come back to some questions on the Cynefin framework later, but I want to talk to you a little bit about complexity science and sense making. What inspired your early interest in complexity science, and how has that field evolved since you started?
Okay, so I got involved just before the turn of the last century. So I'd been in a strategy role in a company that was bought by IBM. After they bought me, they labeled me as a creative. I'd done the turnaround on the other company, so I got put into a free-floating research stroke consultancy role. And the big thing then, which I was looking at, was knowledge management. My academic background is how do you improve decision making? That's always been my speciality. And that led me into conditions of extreme uncertainty, particularly the way that informal networks form in organizations. So we found the ratio in IBM between informal networks and formal systems was 64-1. And the informal networks create channels through which knowledge will flow, but you don't know in advance what that will be. And that brought me logically into complexity theory, which is about entanglement. And then that got exciting. There was a European complexity group, myself, Peter Allen, Brian Goodwin, Max Basso, Bill McKelvey, others, who were sort of starting to look at the application of complexity science to human systems. And complexity has a very different origin from systems thinking. By the way, complexity comes from the natural sciences.
Okay.
Systems thinking really originates in Shannon and Ashby's information science. So that evolved over a bit of time, and it got more and more excited. I mean, the thing I think basically to understand about complexity is it deals with systems which have no linear causality. So you can't say the same thing will happen the same way. It will only happen that way by accident. And the origin of the word complicated in English is a Latin for something which is folded. And of course, something which can be folded can be unfolded and folded again.
Right.
Whereas the Greek origin of complex is something which is entangled. And if something is entangled, it can't be unentangled and tangled again. So complex systems have very high path dependency. You can never start a design from scratch, which has major implications for leadership and organizational development. And you can't engineer the organization. You have to treat it like a complex ecosystem. One of our newer frameworks, SRI mapping, focuses on mapping what you can actually change in an organization before you initiate initiative.
Amazing. Dave, also tell me a little bit about sense making. And when I was reading about you to prepare for this conversation, there was this phrase called naturalizing sense making. Tell me a little bit more about this.
Okay, so there are 5 established schools of sense making. If you look at the literature, the great granddaddy of everybody is Carl Weick. He took an American sociological tradition, studied companies, derived theory. You then get Russell and Al, who come from an IT systems background. That's using IT to make sense of the world. Brenda Dervin, who was a really good friend until, she died last year, which was a tragedy, who really came from library science and brought a narrative perspective. Harry Klein, who did the work on cognitive psychology, is also a really good friend. Spent a lot of time with him over the years. And those are 4 established schools. And naturalizing sense making, which is me and my group. We spell it with a hyphen, not as a word, because we want it to be a verb, not a noun. And we define sense making as how do we make sense of the world so that we can act in it. And with that comes a concept of sufficiency. You never know all that you need to know. So what sort of things can I do based on what I actually know at the moment or can know in the proximate future? That's the principle. Naturalizing, my background is theoretical physics and philosophy, and you'll see that come through. So in philosophy, naturalizing means to root what you do in the natural sciences. And one of the things we used to say when I studied physics is that social scientists suffer from physics envy. Which was a deliberate play on words because they never had enough data to form any conclusion. So we actually don't do case-based derivation of theory. What we do is we say, this is the problem. What do we know from physics, from chemistry, from complexity science, from cognitive neuroscience, which will act as a limit on this? Then we develop methods and tools consistent with that science. That takes about 5-6 years. And it takes about 3 or 4 years to refine them in practice. So to give one simple illustration, one of the things we know is if you give radiologists a batch of x-rays and you ask them to look for anomalies, and on the final x-ray you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, 83% of radiologists will not see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. It's not intentional blindness. And that's something you can't get rid of in humans unless you make them fully autistic.
Right.
Now that invalidates systems analysis, consultants asking questions, rational decision making. All of that stuff just goes out of the window. But you have to rethink the way you do things because the science itself has progressed. So we wouldn't use phrases like mental models, for example. Computers have mental models, human beings don't.
Right.
our body and our social environment make a lot of decisions for us. So it's that intersection of natural science, which has been subject to peer review and repeated experiments, and using that to inform developments in the social space.
Very interesting. And in the context of complexity, how do you view the role of unpredictability and chaos in organizational and strategic decision making?
I think unpredictability goes with chaos. So with complexity. So the whole point about a complex system is you can't predict a future state. And if you try and set explicit goals or targets, you create perverse incentives to ignore what's happening in reality. So one of the things we say about complexity is you start journeys with a sense of direction rather than having goals, which means mapping the present is absolutely key. Chaos theory, which is different, and there are three aspects to this. One is the sort of common sense use of chaos. And you see people who say, for example, the streets of Mumbai are chaotic. Well, actually, they're not. They're complex. I've been there. If you walk in a straight line at a constant space, there's no problem. All right. I mean, it's a constantly adapting set of patterns, which is complexity, right? There's deterministic chaos, which we use a lot. So if you have true randomness, then things follow a normal distribution. So, for example, if I present an idea to my whole workforce, I don't allow them to talk with each other, and I look at the patterns of their interpretation, I can actually make very confident statements about what we should do next. The minute people talk with each other, it becomes a Pareto distribution and it becomes complex, and then you can't predict the future anymore.
Right.
So the whole point is to understand order, complex, and chaos are different. You can move between them, but they require very different leadership and management practices.
Well said. Can you also talk a little bit about the importance of recognizing human capabilities versus machine capabilities in sense?
I mean, there's three types of logic, all right? Deductive, inductive, abductive. So deductive is if A, then B. Inductive is all the cases of A have B. So we use historical data to make statements about the present or the future. That's what AI does. AI is totally dependent on its training data sets. If it meets complete novelty, you've got a problem. And also the training data sets are inherently biased. Some of our work is to create epistemically balanced training data sets, for example. And also, to be quite honest, AI bullshits. It doesn't hallucinate. Human beings hallucinate, but we understand hallucination. And that's part of what's called abductive thinking, which is what human beings do. And if you don't know it, art comes before language in human evolution. And a lot of our language developed from abstractions. And we think the reason art continued to develop to the heights of Wagner and Caravaggio, my personal prejudices, all right, is that what art does is it takes you away from the physical to a level of abstraction. So you see completely novel connections between things. And you can use metaphors in a way a machine never could.
Right.
Part of our worry is human abductive thinking could be destroyed for two reasons. One is become over-dependent on the machines. And the other is the thing the machines do better than us, we don't do. And if we don't do them, we don't develop that abductive capability over time. I had a major row with Sam Polizano on that when I was in IBM, because he said we could replace middle management with AI. I said, well, yeah, you probably could, but where the hell do you think senior management is going to come from if they don't go through middle management? So human beings train themselves in very different ways. A London taxi driver takes 2.5 years to take the knowledge because the hippocampus has to physically change shape. So in human decision making, we're not just binary or even quantum electrical effects. We're chemicals, we're body, we're social environments. Less than 10% of our decisions are made by our brains. And we can't take a metaphor from computers to humans. We've got to learn to balance the two of them.
Right.
And by the way, AI is consuming carbon like there's no tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's even more dangerous. Human beings are far more energy efficient than AI at making decisions.
Absolutely. But the AI is the rage currently. Dave, my next question is on SenseMark. SenseMark was initially developed for counterterrorism purposes. How has its application expanded into other sectors like customer insight, citizen engagement, and risk management?
Yeah, SenseMaker came out of the work we did with DARPA. And that was before 9/11. So I was actually in Arlington the night before 9/11, and the bit of the Pentagon got hit.
Wow.
So next day was, shall we say, interesting, but I was back in the UK by then. So we went from conflict resolution before 9/11 to weak signal detection after 9/11. Particularly, how do you identify when a civilian population is going to go from tacit to explicit support of terrorism? And you can't find that out by surveys or by focus groups or by interviews. You need to understand the street stories. And the big breakthrough we had on that was to make people ethnographers to their own condition. And that's developed hugely since. So, for example, in Malmo in Sweden, got young people to act as ethnographers to adult refugees. And we found things about cultural integration nobody found before. Use Roma children as ethnographers to Roma in Hungary. That was a pioneering project. Yeah. We've actually, moved into the development sector because people's stories reveal the nature of their lives and what's possible. And the key thing SenseMaker does through what's called high abstraction metadata is we give people the right to interpret their own story, not have it interpreted by a computer or by an expert from another culture. And that's really, really important to us as a company. And that's one of the reasons why we've been using Indigenous research in Australia, for example, because we respect the right of people to interpret their own experience. But that is critically, it's a quant approach, not a qual approach. There are three ways we can use SenseMaker. One is as a more effective survey technique.
Okay.
So we're doing that at the moment. You select a cartoon which represents the culture of your company. You tell a story about why you selected it. You index it. You pay a certain amount of money, and every week you get a report on that for 3 months. So that's really easy. That's kind of like a narrative form of survey. And the key thing there is the numbers are what you look for patterns in. And when you see a number pattern, you can look at the stories to explain it. Persuasive power of stories combined with the objective nature of numbers. We also use it for mass decision support. So an executive can present a problem they've got to the whole workforce, ask them to interpret that situation, then look at the patterns of interpretation to find out what people think is general, but also to find the people who have seen a gorilla, the 70%, to find outliers. And then more recently, we've moved into real-time capture on project management in continuous capture, replacing reports. We did that for the first time, by the way, with the US Army in Afghanistan. So we said to young, highly stressed company commanders, if you keep your field records up to date in SenseMaker, you don't have to write a patrol report, which removes stress for them, gave us better data in real time. And we're now doing that on public transport infrastructure projects. We're doing it to detect early signs of racism or misogyny in companies. And that's that sort of continuous micro-narrative capture. So it's really developed substantially over that period.
Fascinating. And how can SenseMaker assist organizations in strategic foresight and preparing for emerging risks?
Various ways on that. There's some major new developments coming down, currently studying insect behavior. Because what's interesting is insects optimize search and without a centralized intelligence. In fact, it's the absence of a centralized directed intelligence which makes the system work. So one thing we can do is present the current situation. This is a variation of what I said to the whole workforce. Ask them to describe what they think is going on, index it, and create a micro scenario about what they think they will happen next. Now that can be done in half an hour. It gives us better data than assembling a small group of people to do a forces and factors analysis and write 5 scenarios.
Right.
And it gives us more patterns. I can then present the patterns back to the same group and ask for commentary. So I can go through multiple iterations until my strategic direction. This is kind of like a huge variation on what's historically been called open strategy. But instead of spending months in workshops and facilitation, I do real-time engagement of my staff. At the end of 1 or 2 days, I can have my direction of travel determined and I can know my staff are on board with it. Yeah, and that is a game changer in strategy.
Amazing. I have time for 2 more questions for you. How do you address ambiguity and uncertainty in decision making?
You don't get rid of it. One of the big problems is why I hate it when people say, how can we reduce complexity? How we contain complexity? It's when people say we will conquer a mountain. You never conquer a mountain. It's a to climb it, right? I still love Machu Picchu in Tibet because nobody has ever climbed that, right? But that's one. So complexity you live with, right? The word Cynefin in Welsh doesn't mean, it literally translates as habitat. What it means in Welsh is the place of your multiple belongings. So it's a sense of being entangled in many different pathways, which you only partly understand, and your ability to manage that flow going forwards. So in terms of managing for uncertainty, and the origin of the word manage in English, by the way, is an Italian word meaning the ability to ride a horse, which is a good way of thinking about management, right? Rather than household management. Where you manage uncertainty is you put everything you can into understanding the present, what you can and can't change. Then you do lots of small things and you see what's sustainable and what works and what doesn't. And then you let the energy flow to those things and move forward. Now, we all know how to do this anyway, because it's how we manage our families and our children. You don't set your children KPIs and link their pocket money with the achievement of milestone targets. And you don't have a family purpose statement.
Right.
You manage the realities of the present and you micro nudge it so it goes in the right direction. And that's how you manage uncertainty.
Wow. Thank you. And my last question to you, Dave, we've been speaking about all the great stuff the Cynefin framework does and the SenseMaker does. What are some of the limitations of the Cynefin framework?
Cynefin is a decision support framework. So it's designed to say, if I'm in this type of situation, I make this type of decision. Yeah. So that is kind of like universal, unless you know a situation which isn't ordered, complex, or chaotic, or somewhere between them, right? But it's for decision making, right? If you want to do situational assessment, well, we have other frameworks for that. If you want to understand life cycle, then there are other frameworks for that. One of the things I've never believed in is a single framework approach. And that's what you see with the FAD cycle. There was nothing wrong with business process re-engineering in core manufacturing. There was everything wrong with it in services. Yeah. And the whole point about Cynefin is to say, well, look, if it's ordered, you can use BPR. If it's complex, you can't. Right? You've got to do something different. So I think we've just launched this thing called Hexi, which is open source. So we got competitors creating Hexi kits. On the basis, you need to be able to put together methods and frameworks from multiple vendors and multiple sources. Create context-appropriate solutions. You don't want a single framework and a single consultancy method from a single source. That actually makes you non-resilient and puts you at high risk.
Well said. And on that note, Dave, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about the Cynefin framework. I've learned many new things, starting with the correct pronunciation. Thank you also for speaking to me about SenseMaker. It's been an absolutely amazing conversation. I'm sure my viewers and listeners are going to love understanding much, much more about the Cynefin framework and SenseMaker and all its practical applications. Thank you for speaking to me and good luck to you.
A real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.